The smell arrived before anything else. Dense, rotten, impossible to ignore. On the streets of central Paris in the summer of 1786, men covered their faces with vinegar-soaked cloths and still retched. The walls of several city blocks around Les Innocents had begun to crack. Beneath them, something was giving way. Something had been giving way for decades, and no one had wanted to see it. What was happening in that city was not a plague. It was not an attack. It was the weight of the dead themselves sinking the floor beneath the living. Paris, in the 18th century, was the most populous city in Western Europe. More than 600,000 inhabitants breathed, traded, loved, and died within its boundaries. And for centuries, all of those dead were buried in the same place, the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents, at the heart of the city, active for over 1,000 years. The pits were opened, filled, and reopened, bodies upon bodies, layers of decomposition stacked to the limits of the unthinkable. But Paris was not a city in collapse, it was a city in glory. The Enlightenment, philosophical cafes, theaters, scientific academies. Voltaire had died that very same year, Rousseau too. Ideas circulated as fast as the carriages on the wide central avenues. The bourgeoisie prospered, the markets overflowed. The city saw itself as the center of the civilized world and had every reason to believe it. It was precisely that greatness that created the problem. While Paris grew upward, the ground beneath it was collapsing from below. Centuries earlier, limestone quarries had been excavated to build the churches, the palaces, the bridges. Notre Dame itself was raised with stone pulled from the city's own entrails. Those tunnels, abandoned and forgotten, formed a network of 300 kilometers of galleries in the dark. And when the Cemetery of the Innocents began contaminating the water wells, sickening the residents nearby, cracking the foundations of houses, the city could no longer pretend it did not know. The decision was brutal in its practicality. Empty the cemeteries, transfer the bones to the underground, use the city's own wounds as a permanent tomb. Between 1786 and 1788, black-draped carts moved through Paris at midnight. Priests followed in procession, chanting Latin in the dark. The bones were dropped through openings in the ground. Femurs, skulls, ribs of people who had lived, loved, prayed, suffered. Names lost, stories dissolved, only bones. What no one expected was what would happen to that place. At first, the catacombs were nothing more than a sanitary deposit, an administrative solution to a public health problem. But Paris was never an ordinary city, and its inhabitants, even in the face of death, needed to make sense of what they saw. The inspectors who descended to organize the bones began stacking them with an almost compulsive order. Skulls lined in rows, tibias crossed into patterns, entire walls built from human bones, arranged with a precision that hovered between the reverent and the deeply unsettling, an aesthetic of the end, an architecture of death. And then the living began to descend out of curiosity. Not officially. In the years that followed, groups of Parisians, artists, philosophers, bohemians, bored aristocrats, found secret entrances and went down into the underground with torches. They held banquets among the bones, they played music, they read poetry aloud, surrounded by skulls. It was the Enlightenment in its most extreme form, confronting death head-on, without superstition, without feigned fearlessness, or perhaps with all the fear in the world transformed into ritual. The city above was seething with revolution on the horizon. 3 years after the transfers began, the Bastille would fall. The world that had built the catacombs would be swept away, and the bones of kings, beggars, heretics, and saints would remain down there, mingled, without hierarchy, without distinction. 6 million people. That is the estimated number of dead resting beneath Paris to this day. There is nowhere else on Earth with a comparable concentration of urban human remains. The city built its modernity atop a continuous layer of death, and chose not merely to live with that, it chose to make it part of its identity. When you walk today through the streets of Paris, over the illuminated pavement, between cafes and bookshops, there is a second Paris just below your feet, silent, cold, permanent. The question that lingers is not about them, it is about us. Every civilization raises its greatness upon something it would rather not see. Every city has its underground. Every era has its bones that it pushes downward and calls progress. The past does not disappear, it only sinks deeper.
History does not live in books. It lives in the spaces between what we know and what we have forgotten. This is the liminal casebook, where every era has a story that was never fully told. If you crossed this threshold with us today, don't leave alone. Bring someone. The next case opens soon.